Question number 13 of the Summa Theologia is about the name of God. And I just want to tell you, as you noticed in the last question, number 12 and 13, and also the next one, 14, on the knowledge of God, are long questions with a lot of articles. So I know your time is so valuable. Most of these videos, I'm trying to keep it about 10 minutes, but when they're this long and this many articles, it's almost impossible to do that. So anyways, have patience with me, and I do respect your time, so I'm going to try to make it as concise as possible. All right. And thank you also for the encouragement and the comments that many of y'all have made about this. I'm glad that you are enjoying your journey through the Summa Theologia. And this one is really interesting. And when we talk about the names of God, we think of we name our kids because we have, they're almost like a certain authority that we have over our kids or our pets, right? This is not that way. The naming of God is only so that we can somehow get to know him better and identify with him. And you're going to see a very, very big connection in the names of God with the attributes of God. Because remember, as we went through those 7 attributes of God, several times Thomas paused and made a very direct connection to our experience of the created world. And you're going to see the same thing in these 12 articles where we're talking about naming God. It's really interesting. And so let's get right into it. And thanks again for journeying with me. Okay, so Article 1, whether a name can be given to God. And that's a very legitimate question, because you ever heard, like, we're not supposed to name our guardian angel, because the guardian angel is higher than us, and we're not naming God in the way that we name a pet or that kind of thing, or even an angel or a child. We're trying to, as I mentioned a moment ago, find some way to better identify with God, and it really shows that we have a great interest in him. All right, Thomas says, it is evident that words relate to the meaning of things signified through the medium of the intellectual conception. Okay, as we have a concept in our mind, we attach words to it. It follows, therefore, that we can give a name to anything in as far as we can understand it. Now, it was shown above that in this life we cannot see the essence of God, but we know God from creatures as their principle, and also by way of excellence and remotion. So right away, Thomas is saying we're not naming God. There's still that confusion about we're never going to comprehend God entirely, but we can understand him. He's knowable, and so therefore, because it's a concept in our mind, remember Anselm's argument we talked about, so we can attach names to it. All right, so that is what he's getting at in article number 1. Article number 2, whether any name can be applied to God substantially. And he says, negative names applied to God, or signifying his relation to creatures, manifestly do not signify his substance, but rather express the distance of the creature from him, or his relation to something else, rather the relation of creatures to himself. So right off the bat, Thomas is saying, okay, in the naming of God, we are showing a relationship between God and creatures, because that's how we come to know things. We come to know all the intelligibles through the physical. And so when we talk about him being infinite, it's just that he's not finite, and immutable, he's not mutable. Those are negatives, right? And then he says, as far as names like goodness and wisdom and things like that, he says these names signify the divine substance and are predicated substantially of God, although they fall short of a full representation of him, which is proved thus, for these names express God so far as our intellects know him. Now, since our intellect knows God from creatures, it knows him as far as creatures represent him. And I just got to pause and say, please, as you go about your everyday life and you see the beauty. I'm looking out my window right now. You can't see it. And I see a tree and I see grass. And I probably, if I look closely enough, would see a bird out there. I don't see it, but there's birds everywhere. Make the connections, because they're all telling us something about God, and even substantially. All right, Article 3, whether any name can be applied to God in a literal sense. And Thomas says, yes, literal is an interesting word. It means in reality, okay? Like I was this picture here I'm showing you, you could say I saw a house literally on top of a car driving down the road. Okay, that doesn't mean figuratively, it's literally, it's really there, right? So Thomas says, as regards what is signified by these names, they belong properly to God, and more properly than they belong to creatures, and are applied primarily to him. All right, so these words like good and wise and simple and these kind of things, we may be able to relate them to creatures, but principally they are related to God, and they are done so in a literal fashion. Well, the names applied to God are synonymous, right? Synonymous means they are the same or like to each other. Thomas says these names spoken of God are not synonymous. Now, it's interesting, and this is a very important teaching in the Summa, because when we label God with all these things, and he's wise and he's good and he's simple, well, the very fact that he's simple means that there's a unity, right? He is. So all these things that we use to describe God is only for our sake, and it's not really in him. So all these words that are kind of similar or synonymous, it's for us and not for God. And he says, our intellect, since it knows God from creatures, in order to understand God, forms conceptions proportional to the perfections flowing from God to creatures. All right, pause. Which perfections pre-exist in God unitedly and simply, whereas in creatures they are received and divided and multiplied, right? We are complex. God is simple, and so they are not synonymous in that regard. All right, number 5. Whether what is said of God and of creatures is univocally predicated of them. All right, I got this picture of this lady because it's like, what the heck? Okay, univocal means equal. Okay, you're good, I'm good. So our goodness, because we share a nature, is univocal. It's the same thing, right? Thomas says univocal predication is impossible between God and creatures. So when we say a person is wise and God is wise, that's not a univocal type of comparison. We're also going to learn 2 other words that are related to univocal, but that's probably a good thing to remember. All perfections existing in creatures, divided and multiplied, pre-exist in God unitedly, right? Hence, it is evident that the term wise is not applied in the same way to God and man. And then, therefore, it must be said that these names are said of God and creatures in an analogous sense, according to proportion. So univocal is equal. Analogous means by comparison. So if I say you are wise and God is wise, there's an analogy there, but it's not univocal, okay? Whatever is said of God and creatures is said according to the relation of a creature to God as its principle and cause, wherein all perfections are said to pre-exist principally in God. On to article number 6, whether names predicated of God are predicated primarily of creatures. And he says in this, these names are applied primarily to God rather than to creatures, because these perfections flow from God to creatures. But as regards the imposition of the names, they are primarily applied to us, to creatures, which we know first. All right, so he's kind of repeating himself a little bit there, but again, can't emphasize it enough. How do we come to know God and his goodness? Through our nature, which is empirical, and we come to know the world, and we say, these things are telling us something about God. There's going to be a question coming up in the future that will really drive this point home, and it's one of my favorite paragraphs of the entire Summa. Number 7, whether names which imply relation to creatures are predicated of God temporally. This is kind of a interesting question. I'll read this brief paragraph here. Okay, so this rabbit, is swift, and you could say the swiftness of God. And so this rabbit obviously is in the temporal world, and God is eternal. So, what gives? Since therefore God is outside the whole order of creation, and all creatures are ordered to him and not conversely, it is manifest that creatures are really related to God himself, whereas in God there is no real relation to creatures, but a relation only in idea, inasmuch as creatures are referred to him. Thus, there is nothing to prevent these names which import relation to the creature from being predicated of God temporally, not by reason of any change in him. I would say in the big picture, that one's probably not terribly important, but I want to cover every article so that you don't get short shrift at all. Okay, number 8, is the name God a name of the nature? Now, nature is related to essence, and I think I've talked about this, but it bears repeating real quickly. When we talk about essence, that's what a thing is, okay? I'm a human being. You're a human being. This is a quarter, okay? So that's the essence. My pen has the essence of a pen. Nature also includes operation. What do we do? Okay, we're rational. We run. We laugh. Things that are a part of all human beings, right? That's part of our nature. Okay, so is the name God the name of the nature? And he says here, because therefore God is not known to us in his nature, but is made known to us from his operations or effects, we name him from these, as was said above. The God is the name of operation so far as it relates to the source of meaning. For this name is imposed from his universal providence over all things. That's part of his nature. Since all who speak of God intend to name God as exercising providence over all, but taken from this operation, this name God is imposed to signify the divine nature. So when we say the name of God, we are referring to his nature and also to his essence, and so that's part of the deal. All right, number 9, is the name God communicable? Do you remember when we talked about, I think it was his infinity, and he was talking about Socrates. Socrates is an individual man, but he has human nature. So in the suppositum of Socrates, that's not communicable because there can only be one Socrates. There can only be one me. There can only be one of this pen. There can only be one of you. But what we share of human nature or pen nature is communicable because there's a lot that share it also. But what he's saying here is that God in his suppositum and in his nature are not communicable because there's only one. All right, so that goes back to the unity of God. That's what it was when we were talking about Socrates, the unity of God. All right, we are chugging along here. Article number 10, whether this name God is applied to God univocally, by nature, by participation, and according to opinion. Remember, univocally means exactly the same, and this kid over here is like, what? Univocal terms mean absolutely the same thing, but equivocal terms absolutely different, okay? Equivocal is different, whereas analogical terms, a word taken one signification must be placed in the definition of the same word taken another sense. So we relate from nature to God analogically, okay? And not equivocally and not univocally, because equivocally would mean there's no connection. Univocally means exactly the same. Analogically would mean there's a relationship, but they're not equal. All right. So, okay, I love this one. You got to get. Thanks for still watching, because this is the payoff here. This is so awesome, because when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and he said, okay, I'm going to go back to Egypt, but they're going to ask me who sent you. Who do I say sent me? And God said, I am sent you. All right, so Thomas is saying, what's the best name for God? He who is, or I am, is the most proper name for God. And there he says, this name is properly applied to God for 3 reasons. For it does not signify form, but simply existence itself. Remember, God is existence. That's part of his simplicity. Hence, since the existence of God is his essence, which can be said of no other, right? So we're going back to the attributes. We're going back to the first attribute there. Secondly, on account of its universality. Therefore, the less determinate the names are, the more universal and absolute they are. Because he didn't say, I am good, I am simple, I am perfect, which he could have, and all that would have been true, but he just said, I am. And that means it's so wide open. It just means I exist. And remember in the Gospels, when Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. And they're like, whoa, you're saying you're God, right? Because Jesus was saying that he was God, and they picked up stones and they wanted to kill him, right? Finally, from its consignification, for it signifies present existence, and this above applies to God, whose existence knows no past or future. All right, so that is so interesting. All right, number 12, I think this is the last one. Yeah, number 12, whether affirmative propositions can be formed about God. Remember, a lot of what we know about God is from what he is not. He is not mutable. He is not finite, right? Thomas says true affirmative propositions can be formed about God. God, however, as considered himself, is altogether one and simple, yet our intellect knows him by different conceptions because it can't see him as he is in himself. That nevertheless, although it understands him under different conceptions, it knows that one and the same simple object corresponds to its conceptions. Okay. You're like, what? All right. The point is, yes, we can make positive affirmations. God is good, God is simple, God is perfect. These are all positive things. These aren't just what he isn't. All right. All right. You see how that the naming of God, the names of God, it all connects to the attributes. It connects to everything. All right. That's why I'll say it again real quickly. Don't just jump into one of these videos and say, "Oh, I'm learning about the Summa." No, if this is the first video you're watching, you're learning a little bit, but you've got to go back. Okay. Well, we won't wait for you, but just catch up. All right. And all right. And I went to Mass today, and I prayed for all of you who are following, through the Summa. And so let's pray for each other and also try to apply this to everyday life, okay? Take these lessons, which sometimes can be challenging, and just take it to prayer and say, God, help me to understand this better, because this is all about not only me understanding you and knowing you better, but also desiring you and hopefully one day, living with you united in heaven. And that's where the whole Summa is leading. All right. That's the last part of the Summa. It's union with God. God bless you. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.